Florence School of Regulation have had today a webinar devoted to the regulation of methane emissions and the impact of new technologies, how to use their advantages and how to stimulate it. We have a privilege today, have a more in-depth conversation with one of our guests today at the webinar, Robert Kleinberg. Robert Kleinberg is well known in the methane emission area, but he has very distinguished career. He worked with Schlumberger, a world leading oilfield service provider, for quite substantial time, but also now he's also joined academia. He's senior fellow at the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and senior research fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy of the Columbia University. Robert, thank you very much for joining us. And we would like to put some questions related to today's webinar, and perhaps even later expanding them more broader. Maria, please.
Okay, so my first question will refer to methane emissions regulations. So over the last few years, we've had different jurisdictions adopting methane regulations and policies, while other jurisdictions did not do that much progress, or they just kept business as usual. So the first question is, what role can you envisage for satellites and aerial measurements in methane emission reduction?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. Just to provide a little bit of background, there ground-based measurements, which can be roving, are inefficient in many places. They fail to capture all the sources of emission just because they do tend to be sort of component focused. Aircraft surveys can be more comprehensive. They benefit from sort of uniform quality control. But on the other hand, not all national authorities welcome overflights of their oil and gas facilities. So our satellites really are unique in that they have an unimpeded global access. That's the good part. The bad part is that the satellite systems that are capable of providing sort of daily coverage of the entire world, like TROPOME, for example, are, as I just mentioned in the webinar we finished, very much sensitive to things like cloud cover. And they only detect the very largest leaks. I mean, the ones that are really off scale to those that even those that we think of being as super emitters. These are super emitters. Now, there are more sensitive satellite systems like have been flown by GHGSat in Canada. And they have good sensitivity, but they need to be targeted. So they need to be told what to look at. They're not surveys. So somehow we have to combine sort of a survey function and a more focused, high precision measurement. And we're just sort of learning how to do that. And we're certainly not there yet. One thing I would like to mention, though, is that perhaps one way forward is to integrate these satellite measurements with perhaps permanent sensors on the ground. A surveillance system sort of setup, and maybe regional, but something that can say, okay, we have a problem in this latitude and longitude. Let's send the satellite to characterize it better. So that may be one approach.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe a follow-up question. So what else could be done in order to ensure that methane emissions are reduced in all major jurisdictions? What do you think can we do?
Well, just this last spring, I taught a seminar at Columbia University on flaring reduction. And it was, so the students wrote a big report. And one thing they did was they looked at among the states in the United States, each one has different laws regarding methane emissions and flaring. And what they did was they looked at each state law, chose the best provisions of each of them, and sort of mixed and matched to get a regulatory regime that was sort of the best of all worlds. It was sort of like playing fantasy football, except with laws instead of forwards or goalkeepers. And that turned out to be pretty interesting. And I think one thing that we could be thinking about is looking at the various national and even state level regulations, picking the best and then trying to put them all together and harmonize them. I think that's one very interesting approach. Of course, if you look at sort of what the U.S. did, I mentioned this in the during the webinar. I would say U.S. regulations have more to learn about what not to do than what to do. And so again, not every example is a positive example, but we can learn from all of them and see where the successes and failures have been.
Robert, you touched on one issue that really interests me a lot. There was mentioned even in today's discussion that perhaps we would need even supranational regulation of global risks. And at the same time, you also mentioned that satellite flying over gas and oil production facilities could be seen as not so friendly. So what is, in your opinion, the new technologies like satellite measurements? They would enhance global cooperation, or actually they could be very much divisive?
You know, that's such a great question, Andris, and I have thought about this over the years, in fact. And one thing is to look back in history and see what has worked. You know, back in the 1970s, when the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were negotiating the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that limited the intercontinental ballistic missiles that each side had. These are nuclear weapons. This is serious. We talk about serious global warming today, but nuclear war is certainly at that level. Basically, what was a breakthrough in those talks was when each side could use what they called national technical means of verification. And what national technical means meant was our satellites can count your intercontinental ballistic missiles. That gave both sides the knowledge and confidence that they knew what the other side was doing. And that was really a huge breakthrough. And I think the same thing could work in the methane realm as well. Once we say we have a uniform way of collecting data, it works the same everywhere. It's vetted by top scientists that we all agree with, international scientists. I think that could really unify the world in saying, okay, here's where the problems are, and everybody has to agree. One set of facts. Another example, and this has sort of been lost in the mists of history, is back in the 1980s, the Natural Resources Defense Council actually had seismic listening posts inside the Soviet Union as a means of verifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Again, you have an international cooperation, everyone agrees, Soviet Academy of Sciences, Natural Resources Defense Council cooperated to ensure that we knew when explosions had occurred, and everyone could agree on it. And I think those were terrific steps forward in international cooperation in the nuclear sphere. And now with global warming being another globally important problem, I think we can utilize those techniques again.
Now, I basically agree, Robert, with this, but I am all the time puzzled about methane emissions. If I see the recent development about methane emission policies related to COVID-19, it's basically the worst news comes, and they come from very competent people. Recently, I saw the message saying, there are more emissions and unused gas seems to release by companies because, the prices are not good. How much we should believe in these stories and who should respond to it? Because I am always going from good faith. So that's I say, but these people say they base their position because more satellite observation actually indicates more emissions, and they have a right to think like this. It's not blackmail. They just follow the facts, and no one says, actually it's not true. No one in industry would imagine unused gas being released in atmosphere.
Oh no,
Where is that?
It does happen. And part of the problem is a reporting scheme. And, certainly a lot of stories have come out of, again, the United States, Permian Basin in West Texas and New Mexico, where it's very well documented that the amount of gas that's vented, natural gas and methane, vented into the atmosphere is far higher than being reported. Part of the problem is that our reporting schemes are really defective. So, for example, there is in many states, again, going back to this comparing state law business, in many states, there's no distinction made between vented and flared gas. Huge difference on greenhouse gas impact, orders of magnitude difference in greenhouse gas impact. But the operator only has to report the sum of those two. That's something that is a very antiquated law. And this is the sort of thing we need to go back and clean up our reporting system and also our measurement system on the ground. And so when we talk about measurement, reporting, verification, this is something that is just super important. And I'm very glad that the European Commission is paying a lot of attention to these methodological points, because they really do address exactly the problem that you raised.
But Robert, would you believe that, well, the company X, they have bad market prices and they continue to produce gas, then they release everything that they produce or part what they produce just in atmosphere, just like this, because venting could be slightly, well, related to technology. You can have defective technology, but it is really criminal intention, at least in my understanding, even if it's not punished by the law. So that's why I tend to say, well, somebody should say, is it true or is it wrong?
Well, okay, so I'm not going to discuss the criminalization issue. And I think the large majority of operators out there want to do the right thing. But, as has been shown, again, in scientific literature and very well documented, the super emitters, the ones that are releasing disproportionate amounts of methane into the atmosphere, are due to upset conditions. This is a technical term in the petroleum industry with which I'm very familiar. Upset condition is when things don't go the way you think they should. So, for example, the unlit flare, okay? So you have a flare stack, you route the waste natural gas, and we could discuss why it's waste natural gas to the flare stack where it's supposed to burn off to carbon dioxide, which is on the scale of methane relatively benign. For some reason, the flare either doesn't go out or is never lit. And right now, we don't have strict enough state laws and procedures within companies to monitor whether the flares are lit. And this is a small proportion. I think people estimate only 1 or 2% of flares don't get lit. It's a small proportion, but that's a disproportionate impact on climate. So a lot of these things can be fixed very simply with just you don't need satellites. You don't need crazy technology. All you need is something to monitor whether the flare is on. We have that sort of facility in our own homes with our gas powered appliances that monitor that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would finish, Robert, with, well, do you believe that we need very stringent regulation, or we could expect something that industry will do by itself? Because, well, I always trust that industry has a lot of interest to do, but as things are evolving, I would say, well, only regulation could really put end to it.
Well, I tend to think that successful regulation is a result of a negotiation with both sides sitting down. I think this is just common sense. And, industry, regulators asking industry, is what we're proposing reasonable? But then also going to outside experts who are also familiar with the technology and sort of doing a fact check. So the question you ask is not a simple question. And there's a huge literature, as you know very well, on design of regulation. It's a hard problem, and I'm going to throw that one back to you. I think that's an excellent problem for the Florence School.
Thank you, Robert. It's appreciated very much. Our guests have been Robert Kleinberg, a senior fellow at the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. Thank you, Robert, for joining your wisdom with us, and we will definitely try to look in it and with your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Happy to be here.